Welcome to another Leadership Conversation, hosted by the Center for Executive Succession at the Darla Moore School of Business. I'm your host, Anthony Nyberg, and today we are speaking with Jim Bagley, the global leader of the firm's human resource practice, and Brad Pugh, who heads the Atlanta office, among other things, for Russell Reynolds Associates, one of the world's leading executive search firms. First, let me say, Jim and Brad, thank you both very much for joining us and for speaking to our students today. We sincerely appreciate having you here.
Delighted to be here. Thank you.
Can you each talk just a little bit about how the events of 2020, so including things like COVID and racial injustice and, of course, geopolitical tensions around the world, have changed the role and expectations for a chief human resource officer?
I'd say past crises have been financial in nature. If you think about the global recession in '08, this one is a human and a social pandemic. So that as a result has put the spotlight on HR leaders and, are our people safe? How can we support them? How can we help them with their families at home? And so, this has created a different lens moving forward for the role that a CHRO plays. And so, I think HR leaders, they're showing their strong project management skills and crisis management skills. It's very different from, keeping the trains running. They've shown that they know how the business makes money and how the people connect to the business operations. And I think they've shown themselves to be socially adept. How do I, as a cultural leader of our company, of our organization, how are we going to relate differently? And they're playing that role with their executive leadership team and the CEO. So I think that's the way people have seen it change from my point of view. Jim, what would you add?
Yeah, the CHRO has been cast front and center as a result of this. So everything that Pat and I and Brad and others have talked about over the years about the role of the CHRO, and we want to have them be impactful and operate at the top and exposure to the board. All the things that we've talked about have come to fruition as a result of COVID, as well as this social pandemic. As a result of that, the CHRO is in a position to actually contribute very overtly to the business and to society, both. And in doing so, they've had to be very adaptable, very quick on their feet, and very commercially connected. The way they do that varies greatly by industry. So if we were to just compare and contrast, say, the healthcare sector, it's a lot about the safety of their own employees, okay, particularly in the delivery of healthcare services. But even if you're in the pharmaceutical sector or the biotech sector, the race for the cure is on, and how do you get collaboration from your R&D department? So, the HR officer is coalescing all of that as we go through this. The flip side to it is we could pick some industry, whether it's the hospitality segment or the travel segment, where they've gone through tough cuts. And then with the people that are remaining, trying to convince them that tomorrow is brighter than today. So it's a very challenging environment for the CHRO. And again, they've been put front and center as a result of these two pandemics that we're going through.
So Jim, can I just follow up with you a little bit and say that I've heard a lot of, especially CHROs, talk about how this is kind of their moment, the way IT was for Y2K, for CFOs during 2007, 8, 9 financial crisis. Do you see, are the rest of the organization and board members recognizing this about CHROs too, or is this something that HR is seeing mostly?
Well, I with a smile, I'll just say Y2K was a dud, wasn't it? But yes, it did get the attention of the CTOs and certainly the CFOs in 2008. Look, I think what's going on is so open, so visible, so impactful to the business. There's this exposure the CHRO to every aspect of the company. So whether it's the board of directors, the executive committee, all of the employees, how you get people to work, how do you transform the business, how do you go remote, how do you go digital, whatever it is, whatever industry it was, which we just mentioned, the CHRO is at front and center of that. And by the way, if and when they get it wrong, it's very clear, it's very obvious to everyone, and it's can be tremendously impactful negatively to the business. So yes, I think the CHRO is sort of in the spotlight for all good reasons, and in most instances responding and performing wonderfully to the moment.
And Brad, given this increased visibility in the platform that HR and CHROs in particular have, where do you think the CHROs or HR more generally can make the biggest impact in their organizations now and over the next 5 years?
I'd say one, the table stakes for HR have risen and will stay high. I mean, in the past it was, are you getting the core blocking and tackling of HR right? And it might have been the way services are delivered, or payroll happening correctly. I mean, those things still remain, but I think as people have, as society has become more digital and more customer experience oriented, I think the same thing happens in HR. So we will see HR as an always on service. Think of it almost as software as a service. I think the sophistication of the way it operates, from an employee experience, digital metrics, just AI, analytics, et cetera, I think that will have a massive impact. It will positively impact headcount, but will also make the other work in HR more strategic. I think cultural leadership is going to be a bigger area where HR will have an impact. It's always been an element, but they haven't been looked at to as a leader. They might be a contributor, but now their CEOs looking at them as a leader with the culture. So I think that will be a significant area. And it's not just culture. It's how do we respond to the need for better civil rights thinking? How is it going to impact our broader wellness of our employees? Not just do they have benefits, but how are we caring for their mental health and their families? I think more broadly, this era that we're in, there will be winners and there'll be losers, and in industries and in companies. And I think, like anybody sitting around the table with the CEO, everybody plays an important role as it pertains to the business and the strategy of the business. And I think HR leaders will be just as likely to spot an opportunity as a chief strategy officer or as a CFO. And so I think the expectations and the leverage that now HR has will expand, and it's a huge opportunity across the next 5 years and beyond.
And Jim, obviously your firm is really at the very front and center of some of the really big changes going on in terms of how the pandemic has forced everyone to work from home, et cetera. So can you talk a little bit about how working remotely has really affected the process of executive search and how that applies for particularly people at the level CHROs or C-suite in terms of how they're interviewing for jobs, and has it really altered the dynamics of which executive recruitment works?
It very much has. If I may just digress for one quick second before I respond to that, just to augment what Brad said, which I agree with every bit of. The one other element that CHROs are really going to need to think about in the next period of time, 5 years, whenever, is the glue. The glue that creates the culture of organizations. So Brad and I know each other. We've worked together. We can sort of call each other's moves. We can laugh. We can, even be difficult with each other, and we get through it. For the next person who joins Russell Reynolds or any company, how do they create the relationships? How do they create the glue across the entire organization that helps it stay together and become a unit and operate similarly, and to get the right thinking and get the right camaraderie and the collegiality right? So I think the CHRO has responded to the moment, but as we look to the future, we've got to run a business. It may be remote, it may be different. We'll get a vaccine, but then something else will happen, whatever. But how do you keep and maintain that glue might be something else that the HR community wants to think of. As far as going back to your question, so thanks for the digression, the moment to digress. Search has changed incredibly in some ways, and in other ways, not at all. So pre-pandemic, our world, and I'd ask Brad to jump in on this too, would be we'd work in our office for a period of time, 3 out of 5 days, whatever the measurement might be. We would travel and go see clients, and recruiters love, by the way, the smell of jet fuel. I mean, you call and say, hey, there's an opportunity somewhere. Man, they're off to the airport and they go. And that's changing. And then our ability to interact with candidates has also changed. So we were pre-pandemic doing a lot of videos like this to do initial interviews, because to fly as much as we like to fly all over the country to see one person, it's just hard to find the time to do that. And then we would see the person physically as the search progressed. So some of it was already going on, but for clients, I think the notion of hiring somebody without ever meeting them in person was a big adjustment. And it was both our direct clients as well as, for example, the private equity firm. So if we were doing a search for a portfolio business of a private equity firm, we might be able to convince the CEO of the portfolio company to go ahead, but then to convince the private equity firm, at least initially in April and May, whenever, I think everyone's adjusted now. And now, it's just a date stamp this, it's October in 2020. We just did a search for a $65 billion business in the Midwest to find CHRO. And that successful candidate actually flew to Chicago and met the CEO in their backyard. At a distance and all, masked up, et cetera. But, they wanted to meet each other. So we may be trickling back towards that. But fundamentally, we've gone remote almost everything. Brad?
Yeah, I agree 100%. The only other element is our client interactions. We would maybe meet our client in person the first time, and then it would be phone calls. And it's been nice to be on video. Everyone's adoption of video means our interaction, I think, is richer. We catch up briefly on the personal side, what's happening at home, and then we're interacting. And there's something to be said for video to see people's reaction as they talk about a candidate, for example.
Do you two see this like being the way of the future? Like, is there something we're missing from being in person, or is this really have so many advantages like you're talking about that this is the way it ought to be?
I think video will stay in our client interactions for our, biweekly check-ins and catch-up meetings. I think screening calls where we're, just having an initial exploratory conversation. We were already doing this. And so that will stay, and everyone will be more comfortable. There will be less, fumbling at the beginning of these things. At the end of the day, people like to meet people in person. I think it'd be nice if more people are having their potential new CHRO over their back porch before you jump into a 5-year relationship that you're counting on to keep you successful. I think some of that could stay, not with the masks, of course, and the precaution, but.
I'm hopeful we come out of this and approach it like I try to approach my golf game, which is I try to forget the bad stuff very quickly and remember the good stuff for a long time. So I do believe that this moment will fundamentally change how all of us, including you, just as we're doing right now, I think it's going to change how we do things and how we approach things. But there'll still be the element of wonderful human nature aspects of our business and your great academic programs where, community it has its place and interaction and, the relationships have their place. So I do hope that we take everything that's good and hang on to it. And just as Brad said, the sort of being invited into your home this morning. it's really wonderful. At the same time, I hope we can get back to some of what we've experienced in the past.
So can you just, even building on that a little bit, say, and maybe even from the board perspective or anywhere in the C-suite, how does this, so I can understand how maybe it even makes it easier to screen, especially early on in the process. But how about things like onboarding? Do you see that as a challenge? Because you've been talking a little earlier about how does the CHRO really keep that culture going? Can companies do it? Are we as social beings capable of really becoming part of this group when we're not physically connected?
I certainly, I think that, by the way, yes, we're seeing the onboarding, and, just to bring it to life, recruited a CHRO to a gigantic West Coast business, 300,000 employees. They were East Coast, and search went just like this, and as we've described, remotely, digitally, et cetera. And day came for the person to start, and this entity suggested that this person fly to the West Coast, check into a hotel room, and then do all their onboarding virtually from the hotel room. And the person said, well, hang on, why don't I just stay here, instead of sitting in a hotel room by myself? And that's what they've done. And it's just a little bit of a fun story to say how we're all adjusting, and we've got to think about what we're doing. But in those instances, this individual has met with all the execs. They've gone to all the executive committee meetings, all the operating committee meetings, all the board meetings, et cetera, virtually. And they seem, everything's going according to plan. The CEO thinks they're doing a great job. The CHRO's happy. We've spoken with board members. So it's working, but it takes a gigantic adjustment on everybody's part, including the person that we recruit.
But we have to keep separate remote working from COVID, because when we have a vaccine, when people are not at risk, we might not come here to the office every day, but we're definitely going to go out and do the team building, the times together. Maybe we're getting together in more meaningful ways when we do get together. But I think there'll be a hybrid approach.
And Jim, our data suggests that a large portion of CHROs are hired into their roles from outside the firm. I mean, we found it almost 70%, which is really quite different than CEOs and CFOs, which on average seem to come from more inside. So based on your experience, one, do you kind of see similar things? And also, if you do, why do you think that HR leaders are more inclined to come from the outside? Is that a lack of talent or something else?
Well, in answering the question, I'll just begin with, this is where Pat Wright and I began, because my initial conversations with Pat were around, I'd like to try to help the HR community get better so that there's better succession within the HR community. Because HR, and this is just the way that I think, HR is responsible for succession, but how can you be responsible for succession when your own succession in your own group isn't so good? And I remember Pat saying to me, well, I don't understand, Jim. Why would you want it to get better? Won't that hurt your business? And I said, well, no, I don't think it will, because if we have more talent out there that's more capable, then it's good for everybody, I think. So it's sort of an open network kind of approach to this question. It remains an opportunity for human resources. So our metrics show that when there's a change in CEOs, 62% of the time, there's a new CHRO within 2 years. If you go out 3 years, it's even higher, obviously. And the split between internal, external doesn't take that into account. It's just almost 2/3 of the time there's someone new. And that's maybe the beginning of the answer, which is that the relationship between the CHRO and the CEO is so personal and so in need of having that connection of they don't need to even say anything, or they can finish each other's sentences. And I recall being asked by a very significant CEO to come visit, and they had a CHRO was going to retire. That person had recruited a number two, and had given them all the exposures that you'd think would be necessary. And the CEO said to me, now, we've got this number two person who, is really pretty good. And I wish I could tell you why, but they're just not it. And I think there's a lot of that goes on. And then the second piece, which I bet Brad would talk to, is, giving your team the exposures. So Brad?
Yeah, the internals, what they'll lack is they might be seen, they'll be pigeonholed in the way people view them. That is so-and-so's person, or that is the person who does that in our company. They're not seen as a well-developed all-around athlete that external candidate might bring. And so CHROs, when doing this well, they're moving their HR leaders around. Let's give this person a stint in the total rewards role. So they're gaining exposure to the board and seeing the way that things operate at the top in those conversations. They're moving them into a massive M&A project so that they're thinking around the financials or getting a macro picture on the business and adjacencies. So there's great opportunity, and fortunately some CHROs do this really well. But as Jim said, it's a big opportunity still.
Just one last very quick point is, if we had a recommendation to the CHROs, it would be give your team more exposure to the board, and maybe even rotate somebody through the rewards role to give them the design of executive comp, because those are the two things that when we do searches, if there's something missing, that's what's missing in some of the candidate universe. Sorry to interrupt.
No, that's perfect and really interesting and really related. I was just about to ask Brad to follow up on, so given these challenges and what you've said, I was wondering if there were some areas that CHROs really need to stand out in to make them sort of more available. And is that the exec comp and exposure to boards?
That's what gets them in the job. So as we're talking about succession, I think the things Jim and I just laid out are what gets people in the job. What makes somebody really good? And when I'm interviewing CHRO candidates, one of the things that I enjoy seeing in great HR leaders is the way they, number one, have an outside perspective, so outside the walls of their company, and number two, the way they've built networks of leaders, of collaborators outside of their company as well. So outside perspective, meaning before the chief strategy officer or the CIO comes and says, "Hey, have you seen how 3D printing works?" They've hopefully read about it. Maybe they've seen it. Before they're having a reading about executive briefing with their leadership team, a geopolitical trend or economic trend emerging in China, have they themselves engaged and learned through other organizations that they're part of? So when I see somebody who's not just engaged in an HR forum, for example, but in a broader leadership and strategy discussion at their own initiative, that's a really a beautiful differentiating. And then secondly, when difficult times come as a CHRO, you often don't have, it's a lonely job. These top jobs are lonely, and you're placed between the board and the CEO and the stakeholders internally, and you need to have somebody who's sitting in your same job that can give wise counsel. And the great CHROs during this pandemic, both social and health pandemic, have been able to call on their friends at other organizations and friends that they could say, "Here's what I'm dealing with. How would you advise? How can we work together even? Can you take these 10,000 employees that I'm having to furlough and hire them in your organization?" And we've seen great CHROs do that. So I think, that gets beyond just the normal HR elements, and that's a differentiator that just makes great CHROs.
And it does seem like, at least from our view, that CHROs really are part of a pretty tight community, especially if you said the really good ones, right? They are. The
really good ones are, absolutely.
So Jim, we spoke a little bit about the numerous challenges that are going on, and arguably as are more impactful, especially within the United States, that's from COVID, is this social unrest that's going on. And all of the reports we get kind of fighting about whether there actually is a pipeline for diverse talent or how long it might be, but we see it at board levels, we see it in the C-suite. What can we be doing as a society to actually make better opportunities for underrepresented groups?
Yeah. Well, I don't know that I'm in a position to opine on what society can do, but I would venture to say, what can we do? And certainly, we can create more awareness. We can be sensitive in ways that we haven't been sensitive previously. We can be thoughtful about this as a topic. But I think that from a search standpoint, there's maybe two things we can do. Number one is make sure that we know the diverse talent that's out there. And while we're being thoughtful and sensitive, there's nothing like actually recruiting a diverse individual to a significant CHRO role to help make a statement around this is important. So if we could get results that speak to that, and we do, we think that'd be important, number one. Number two is I think that there's an opportunity for people like Brad, myself, and our team to work with entities, maybe, and we've spoken to at least briefly the Executive Leadership Council on who's the up and coming talent, and sort of like we're doing with you and your program at South Carolina. Can we also work with them on what are CEOs looking for? And what do you need to do in order to get yourself ready to be at that moment? So you're getting mentoring internally, you've got friends at the ELC, you've got whatever, but we can probably play an active role with a group in order to help create more talent that's more ready at a future date. So it's going to take an investment on our part.
And Brad, what we're learning about the ability to do much more of this online and the way we're doing it now virtually, does that make things more challenging for groups that have not been kind of recognized as openly, or does it make it easier because they can be exposed to a larger group of people?
I mean, I would say the doing things digitally like we have done, I think has, distance is no longer a factor in building at a surface level building relationships. And so, and I think, like our time as recruiters, we're not sitting on planes. We're not, we have more opportunity. I'm probably speaking with more people today than I had been in the past. And I'm just more aware. I mean, we exist, Russell Reynolds. We always say this. We exist in order to improve the way the world is led. And so, if I'm not, in any given day, if I'm not talking to people who can help move that agenda forward, great leaders, and we need more leaders in this world. So Jim and I are constantly talking to people that we've never met, reaching into communities and schools, and that's where we spend our time. And I think this digital environment has allowed us to do more of that. We look forward, though, just to being together and just being in your classroom and getting the kids your students afterward via coffee and whatnot. So there's no substitute. But at the front of the spear, we can definitely do more because of technology.
Speaking of the classroom and technology, we're getting pinged by Pat. I'm sure you are as well. So whatever you want to do, we're good.
Well, no, I think that's perfect. I'm gonna tune in and watch you in the classroom also. So again, thank you very much for all your time. I really appreciate it.
Really nice to meet you, and thank you very much.
Good to meet you. Thank you.
You just listened to another leadership conversation. Today, Jim Bagley and Brad Pugh emphasize the importance and opportunities that HR professionals have at this time. As they noted, 2020 is shining a brighter light on HR than ever before. And HR is the area to make a meaningful difference. On behalf of all of us who are associated with the Master of Human Resources program here at the University of South Carolina and the Center for Executive Succession, thank you for joining us.